On Christmas Eve in 2002, a beautiful, 8 months pregnant woman seemed to vanish into thin air from a quiet suburban street in Modesto, California. By nightfall, her golden retriever was found wandering the neighborhood with his leash still attached. Her car was still in the driveway. Her purse and keys were inside the house. And her husband was telling police he had spent the day alone, fishing on the cold, gray waters of San Francisco Bay. Within months, the bodies of that woman and her unborn son would wash ashore in that very same bay. Her name was Laci Peterson, and almost immediately, the question that obsessed the entire country was simple and brutal. Was her husband, Scott Peterson, a heartbroken victim, or a chillingly calm killer who thought he had planned the perfect crime? To understand how this story became one of the most infamous true crime cases in modern American history, we have to go back to the beginning, long before the headlines, the talk shows, and the Netflix docuseries that would later reopen old wounds and fresh debates. Laci Denise Rocha grew up in a close, tight-knit family in California's Central Valley. She was known as warm, outgoing, and a little bit meticulous, the kind of person who made lists, loved decorating for the holidays, and wanted life to look as beautiful as it felt. Friends remember her smile, her energy, and how much she loved the idea of being a wife and a mother. In the mid-1990s, she met a charming young man named Scott Peterson. He was handsome, polite, and ambitious, with an easy, practiced smile and a smooth way of talking that made people instantly comfortable. They began dating, and to the outside world they looked like the perfect couple, attractive, well-matched, building a future together. They married in 1997 and settled into what looked like a picture-perfect life. They eventually moved into a small, cozy single-story house on Covina Avenue in Modesto, California. It wasn't a mansion, but it had everything they needed: a yard, a nursery that Laci was lovingly decorating, and space for their dog, Mackenzie, to roam. Laci worked, kept the house, and poured herself into preparing for the baby that she and Scott had already named Connor. Scott worked in fertilizer sales, a job that required travel and long hours, but also offered the promise of a comfortable, middle-class life. By late 2002, Laci was around 7.5 months pregnant. Her due date was February 10, 2003. It was supposed to be their first Christmas as soon-to-be parents. Laci was nesting. She was planning Christmas Eve dinner, shopping, wrapping gifts, and talking excitedly about baby names, baby clothes, and the future. She just recently stopped working full-time so she could focus on her pregnancy and the home. According to friends and family, she was thrilled. There was no sign that she wanted to disappear, run away, or leave this life behind. On December 23, 2002, the day before Christmas Eve, Laci visited Salon, where her sister Amy worked. Amy cut Scott's hair, as she did regularly. Scott offered to pick up a fruit basket Amy had ordered from a nearby store, saying he would be in that area the next day to play golf. That detail would later become important. That evening, Laci spoke to her mother, Sharon Rocha, on the phone. They talked about typical holiday things: dinner plans, gifts, family. It was a normal, ordinary conversation that no one knew would be their last. According to Scott, the next morning, Christmas Eve, he last saw Laci around 9:30 a.m. He said she was watching a Martha Stewart segment on TV about baking and making meringue, planning to mop the floor, bake cookies, and then take Mackenzie for a walk in a nearby park. He told detectives he decided not to play golf after all, and instead drove to the Berkeley Marina to go fishing for a few hours on his small aluminum boat, alone. At around 10:30 a.m., a neighbor found Mackenzie wandering outside the Peterson home with his leash still attached. She put the dog back into the Petersons' backyard, assuming somehow the dog had just gotten loose. That small, eerie detail would haunt people later. A pregnant woman allegedly out walking her dog, yet the dog returns home alone, leash trailing, and there is no sign of Laci. That evening, when Laci still hadn't shown up, worry turned to panic. Scott said he returned from Berkeley, showered, ate, and eventually called Laci's mother to ask if Laci was with her, worried but not frantic. When no one could find her, the family contacted police. The Modesto Police Department responded and arrived at the home on Covina Avenue. They were walking into what, at first, was treated as a missing person case. But almost immediately, things felt off. Inside the house, officers saw signs that Laci had been preparing for a normal day. Her purse, keys, and wallet were still there. Her car was still in the driveway. The house did not look ransacked. A table was partly set. There was no obvious sign of a struggle, but the scene did not fit the idea of a woman who had simply decided to walk away. At 7.5 months pregnant, without her belongings, without her car, with a holiday family gathering hours away, vanishing voluntarily looked unlikely. As the hours ticked by, the search began. Family members, neighbors, and strangers joined in. Flyers with Laci's smiling face and pregnancy photos went up around Modesto. Volunteers combed parks, fields, and canals. Law enforcement brought in dogs, helicopters, and search teams. The story exploded across local news and then national media. A beautiful, pregnant woman, missing on Christmas Eve in a quiet California town. It was the kind of case that the media would not let go. From the very beginning, investigators paid close attention to Scott. In every missing spouse case, the partner is always looked at closely, but they also needed his help. They asked him to retrace his steps. He told them he had left home in the morning, driven roughly 90 miles to Berkeley Marina, launched his boat, and spent a few hours fishing before returning. He gave them times, receipts, and a basic outline. Detectives noted his calmness, his somewhat flat effect, the way he seemed to be cooperating but not devastated. Reactions to trauma are different for everyone, but officers on scene later said they felt something wasn't quite right. In the days that followed, the search for Laci became a full-blown national story. There were candlelight vigils, prayer circles, and emotional press conferences where Sharon Rocha begged the public for help in finding her daughter and unborn grandson. Strangers sent money, time, and messages of support. Volunteers organized in a massive volunteer center that handed out assignments, maps, and flyers. Scott appeared on camera, sometimes holding missing person posters, sometimes speaking quietly about wanting Laci to come home. But the public, and many watching closely, saw something else. They saw a husband who did not cry much, who seemed oddly composed, and who, according to some volunteers, did not seem to be spending his time searching with the same desperation as Laci's family. Whether that was fair or not, public opinion was already starting to tilt. Behind the scenes, detectives were digging deeper. They examined Scott's alibi. If he said he went to the Berkeley Marina that morning, they needed proof. They checked toll records, receipts, cell phone pings, and surveillance footage. They confirmed that he had indeed been there. That detail would become chilling months later, when the shoreline near where he had been fishing became the place where Laci and Connor's remains were found. As the days stretched into weeks, leads poured in. Supposed sightings of Laci in different cities, reports of a pregnant woman seen arguing with a stranger, rumors that she had been kidnapped or that she had voluntarily left. None of them panned out. The case seemed stuck. And then, a bombshell dropped that changed everything. On December 30th, 2002, a young woman named Amber Fry walked into the Modesto Police Department and told detectives something they could hardly believe. She said she had been seeing Scott Peterson. She believed he was single. She had no idea his wife was missing or that his wife had ever been pregnant. She had met him in November 2002 through a mutual friend, and they had gone on dates. He had told her he was a widower, that his wife had died, and that this would be his first Christmas without her. He said that before Laci was publicly reported missing. For detectives, the puzzle pieces started snapping into place. They now knew that while Laci was happily planning the future with their son, Scott was secretly living a double life with another woman, painting himself as a grieving man, already freed from a marriage that, at least on paper, still existed. That timing was impossible to ignore. Police asked Amber to help them. They gave her a device to record her conversations with Scott, hoping that he might confess to something, slip up, or reveal details about what happened to Laci. Over the next weeks, Amber and Scott had numerous phone calls, many of them emotional. In one of the most haunting, he called Amber from a New Year's Eve candlelight vigil in Modesto, held in Laci's honor. Fireworks exploded in the background while he told Amber he was in Paris for New Year's, alone, thinking of her. She had already begun working with police. Those recordings would later be played in court and broadcast across America. Public opinion turned sharply. The story of the devoted husband searching for his missing wife was replaced by a new narrative. The cheating husband with a secret girlfriend. lying about being a widower before his wife even disappeared. For many, that was enough. They believed Scott had motive to escape the responsibilities of fatherhood, the constraints of marriage, and to start a new life without the messy complications of divorce. Still, there was one huge problem. There was no body. There was no clear physical evidence of a murder scene. There was no murder weapon. The prosecution had suspicion, motive, and a shaky alibi, but not the hard, undeniable proof juries are often taught to expect. That changed in April 2003. On April 13, 2003, a couple walking their dog along the shoreline at Point Isabel Regional Shoreline Park in Richmond, California, found the badly decomposed body of a male fetus on a tidal flat of San Francisco Bay. The location was not far from the Berkeley Marina where Scott said he had been fishing on Christmas Eve. The fetus appeared to be late term, near full term. The next day, April 14th, a jogger spotted a partial female torso, wearing maternity clothing, washed up in the riprap along the same shoreline, about a mile away. There were no hands, no head, and the body was in an advanced state of decomposition. The remains were sent for DNA testing. On April 18th, authorities confirmed the unthinkable. The woman was Laci Peterson, and the fetus was her unborn son, Connor. The missing person case was officially a double homicide. At that point, police moved quickly. They had been tracking Scott's movements for months, monitoring his phone calls, watching where he went and who he talked to. In the days after the bodies were found, Scott drove to San Diego, near the Mexican border, supposedly to stay close to his family. Investigators were worried he might try to flee the country. On April 18, 2003, the same day the identification of the bodies was announced, detectives arrested Scott Peterson at Torrey Pines Golf Course in La Jolla, California. He was meeting his father and brother for a round of golf. When they searched his car, they found nearly $15,000 in cash, camping gear, multiple cell phones, a large amount of clothing, and his hair and beard had been dyed a lighter, almost blonde color. He also had his brother's driver's license in his possession. To prosecutors, this looked like a man preparing to disappear. To Scott's defense team, these were explanations waiting to be given. Scott was charged with 2 counts of murder: first-degree murder for killing Laci and second-degree murder for killing Connor. The state argued that the murders were intentional, planned, and carried out with premeditation. Media coverage, already huge, went into overdrive. The case moved from local news to a constant presence on national shows, legal talk programs, and the 24-hour news cycle. It became a spectacle, a real-life courtroom drama playing out in front of millions. The trial ultimately had to be moved from Modesto to Redwood City in San Mateo County due to the overwhelming publicity and concerns about finding an impartial jury. Scott's defense team was led by high-profile attorney Mark Garagos, known for representing celebrities and handling media-heavy cases. The lead prosecutor was Rick DeStaso. The prosecution's case was built largely on circumstantial evidence. They argued that Scott had planned the murder in advance. They focused on his purchase of a small aluminum fishing boat just weeks before Laci disappeared, a boat that he had not told many people about, including his wife's family. They pointed to a concrete anchor found in the boat, and impressions on the floor of his warehouse that suggested more anchors had once existed. The theory was that Scott had used multiple homemade concrete anchors to weigh Laci's body down in the waters of the bay, so that she would never be found. The fact that her torso and Connor's body later washed ashore did not disprove that theory. Tides, storms, and time can move even weighted remains. They also introduced forensic evidence. A single hair found on a pair of pliers in Scott's boat that matched Laci's hair through mitochondrial DNA testing, and the exact location on the bay where Scott said he went fishing, which lined up disturbingly with the area where the bodies were later discovered. They argued that this was not coincidence. They played Amber Frey's recorded phone calls for the jury, letting them hear Scott's own voice as he lied about being in Paris, as he described his imaginary widower status, and as he talked to Amber about a future together while volunteers were still combing the countryside for his missing wife. The defense pushed back hard. Garagos emphasized that there was no eyewitness to any murder, no bloodstained crime scene, no instrument of death. He argued that the state had no idea how Laci died, when exactly she died, or even where she died. Without those answers, he said, "You could not convict a man of murder beyond a reasonable doubt." He suggested that Laci might have been abducted while walking the dog, and that whoever took her could have been responsible for her death and the disposal of her body in the bay. There were reports of a burglary across the street around the time of her disappearance. The defense hinted that this might be connected. Garagos also tried to attack the reliability of the tidal and drift analysis that placed the bodies washing ashore in the area where Scott said he had been fishing. Ocean currents are complex, he argued, and scientists themselves admitted their models were not exact. But the biggest hurdle for the defense was the affair. Amber Frey took the stand and told the jury her story: how she met Scott, how he presented himself as single, then as a widower, how she felt betrayed when she learned about Laci, and how she decided to cooperate with police. The recordings of their calls gave jurors a window into Scott's double life. For many watching, that wasn't just evidence of adultery, it was evidence of deceit, callousness, and a willingness to lie on a grand scale. It fed the prosecution's narrative that he was capable of planning and carrying out murder. The trial was long and tense. Jurors were sequestered, cut off from the outside world. The media dissected every expression, every word, every move. Talk shows hosted legal analysts who argued nightly about whether the evidence was enough to convict. Inside the jury room, things were not smooth. One juror was removed for misconduct after doing outside research. The jury foreman, himself an attorney, later requested removal amid reports of tension and even alleged threats inside the deliberation room. Those changes raised questions that would become important years later on appeal. But in 2004, most of the public did not yet know the significance of those decisions. On November 12, 2004, the jury returned its verdict. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder in the death of unborn baby Connor. In the penalty phase that followed, the jury recommended the death penalty. On December 13, 2004, the judge formally sentenced Scott to death, sending him to San Quentin State Prison, where he would spend years on death row. For Laci's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but not closure. Sharon Rocha, devastated yet resolute, became an outspoken advocate for victims and for violence against pregnant women. In 2004, she stood at the White House as President George W. Bush signed the Unborn Victims of Violence Act into law, also known as Laci and Connor's Law. The law recognized that harming or killing an unborn child during the commission of certain federal crimes could be charged as a separate offense. Laci and Connor were buried together in Burwood Cemetery, their headstone bearing her maiden name, Rocha, at the request of her family. For years, the case seemed settled. In the public imagination, Scott Peterson became the archetype of the handsome, charming husband who murdered his pregnant wife for freedom. Documentaries, true crime specials, talk show retrospectives, and books cemented that story. He lived on death row, maintaining his innocence, filing appeals, but mostly disappearing from the nightly news. Then, slowly, cracks began to appear in the legal foundation of the case. Not necessarily in the facts as presented, but in the way the trial had been conducted. In 2020, nearly 2 decades after the murders, the California Supreme Court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence. The court found that the trial judge had made significant errors during jury selection, particularly by dismissing prospective jurors who expressed general objections to the death penalty, but also stated they could follow the law and impose it in an appropriate case. That, the court said, violated Scott's constitutional rights regarding the penalty phase. However, the court did not overturn his convictions for murder. In 2021, prosecutors decided not to retry the penalty phase. Instead, Scott Peterson was re-sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, removing him from death row but leaving him locked away for the rest of his life. For many, nothing had really changed. He was still convicted, still imprisoned, still, in their minds, guilty. But the story did not end there. In 2024, the LA Innocence Project, a nonprofit legal organization known for reinvestigating convictions and pursuing claims of wrongful imprisonment, filed new documents in court regarding Scott's case. They claimed to have new evidence, including potential issues with juror misconduct and alternative explanations for what might have happened to Laci. A judge granted Scott a status hearing to consider these filings. once again pulling the Peterson case back into headlines and renewing an old debate. Was this a tragic but properly decided case built on circumstantial evidence? Or had the system possibly convicted the wrong man based on emotion, media pressure, and an affair that made him look monstrous regardless of what truly happened? 2 decades after Christmas Eve 2002, this case refuses to fade. The Netflix docuseries American Murder, Laci Peterson, released in 2024, revisits the story through interviews with Laci's mother, friends, and others who lived through it. It doesn't just retell the facts. It forces viewers to sit with uncomfortable questions about media coverage, public opinion, and what it means to be certain in a case where there is no recorded confession, no eyewitness, and a crime scene that may never be fully understood. What we know for sure is this. On a cold December morning, a pregnant woman named Laci Peterson vanished from a house filled with Christmas decorations and baby dreams. Months later, her broken body and that of her unborn son were found in the same bay where her husband claimed to have gone fishing alone. A jury listened to the evidence, heard about his secret affair, studied the maps, the timelines, the phone calls, and decided that he was responsible, not just for one life, but for 2. What we don't know, and may never fully know, is what really happened behind the closed door of that Modesto home in the final moments of Laci's life. Was it a carefully planned murder by a man who wanted out? A sudden, violent act of rage? Or, as his supporters sometimes argue, something far darker and more random, committed by someone who has never been caught? Those are the questions that keep this case alive in the public imagination. In the end, the story of Laci and Scott Peterson is not just about a crime. It is about trust and betrayal, about how a seemingly perfect life can hide fractures that no one sees until it's too late. It is about how a single Christmas Eve can mark the brutal dividing line between before and after for a family, a community, and a nation watching from their living rooms, wondering how well they really know the people they love.